Getting to know your calculator. You can break calculators down into three general categories: basic, scientific, and graphing. There's probably no better example of an obsolete technology hanging on than the 21st century graphing calculator. In an age of cheap laptops, smartphones, and tablet computers, there are any number of options that are cheaper, more powerful, and far simpler to use. So we're going to skip the graphing calculator for now, and we are also going to skip the basic because, well, they're pretty basic. This is what comes up if you Google the word calculator. I don't think there is any official designation here, but when you see a calculator labeled scientific, you will almost always see the three following categories of functions and their inverses. Inverses are functions that switch the order of input and output. Almost all scientific calculators have an inverse key labeled f to the negative 1, or in this case, inv. For example, the square root function is the inverse of the square function. You can see how they both fall in the same position once you hit the inverse key. We'll have more examples in a minute. Let's start with the constants. Pi and e. In case you've forgotten, these are both very important irrational numbers. You probably remember that being irrational means that if we tried to write these numbers down as decimals or as fractions, which is basically the same thing, or otherwise as ratios, it would take forever. That's where the word irrational comes from, because you can't write them as ratios. If you push one of these buttons, pi or e, the calculator will approximate the value to about 10 or 12 decimal places. These numbers both come up all the time in math and science, so it would be a real pain to try to remember the approximations and type them every time you needed them. Next we come to the trig functions. You'll notice these top two buttons, degrees and radians. Those are telling us which units we want to use when we're doing trig problems. If you haven't heard of that second term, don't panic. Radians are for more advanced work. If you're not familiar with the term, chances are what you want to work in are degrees. The trigonometric functions listed here are sine, cosine, and tangent. Each of these functions works the same way. You plug in an angle from a right triangle, and the function will give you the ratio of two of the sides. If we hit the inverse key, we get inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent. That's what that little -1 superscript means. Inverse trig functions, as you might expect, are just trig functions done backwards. You enter the ratio and it gives you the angle. The third column involves exponential and logarithmic functions. For some reason, the people who designed this calculator decided to put the log functions in the first screen and have you hit the inverse button to get the exponential functions. It doesn't make any difference from a mathematical standpoint, but since most people find exponents simpler than logarithms, it can be a bit confusing. For that reason, I'm going to start talking about the exponential functions, the one you get by hitting the inverse key. One of the most useful buttons on the calculator is the X to the Y key, particularly if you remember your basic rules of exponents. For example, if you wanted to find out what 5 to the third power was, you would hit 5, then you would hit the X to the Y key, then you would hit 3, and then you hit equal, and you get 125. I don't want to spend a lot of time on logs and exponents right now. It's a big topic, but let's take a quick look at 10 to the x and the log base 10 key, because I think they'll help you see the relationship between exponents and logs. The 10 to the x key gives you the powers of 10. For example, if you hit 6 and then hit x to the 10 key, you will get the answer 1 million, because 1 million is the 6th power of 10. 6 zeros. Log base 10 works exactly the opposite way. If you type in 1 million, 10 to the 6th power, and hit the log key, it will give you the answer 6. That's what logs do. They give you the exponent you need to get a certain number. The trig and exponential functions are the big ones. But while we are here, let's take a quick look at a couple more. Factorial functions. See the exclamation in the corner? That doesn't mean you should exclaim the letter X loudly. It stands for x factorial. A rather odd concept, but one that does come in handy when doing probability problems. This is how it works. For a given number, say 5, you multiply all the numbers from 1 to that number together. 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5. So that will give you 120. I doubt you'll have much practical use for this function outside of a few probability applications, but it is kind of cool. Scientific notation. This key isn't really all that necessary since we already have the 10 to the x key, but it is a slightly quicker way of writing big round numbers. For example, if you wanted to write 2 million, you would first think of it as 2 times a power of 10, specifically 10 to the 6th power, because there are 6 zeros in 2 million. Then you would hit 2, then the exp key, then 6, then hit equal, and that would give you 2 million. That 2e6 is another way of writing 2 million. That covers the fundamentals. Now take some time on your own to play around with these functions until you feel reasonably comfortable with them.